I never understood why my husband Marcus suddenly started taking separate transportation to events until that February night when he left me stranded on the subway platform in freezing rain, disappearing into the night with his business associate while I stood there soaked and shivering in my evening dress. As I watched the taillights of his Mercedes fade into the distance, everything crystallized with painful clarity: the mysterious late meetings, the sudden changes in our financial arrangements, the way he'd started treating me like an inconvenience rather than his wife of 6 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The icy rain pelted down on the exposed platform at Central Station, turning my carefully styled hair into wet strings and my designer dress into a clinging, freezing nightmare. Marcus had insisted we take the subway to the charity gala downtown, claiming it would be more environmentally conscious and set a good example. I should have known something was wrong when a man who hadn't used public transportation since college suddenly developed a passion for mass transit. The evening had started promisingly enough. The annual Business Leaders Charity Gala was one of the most prestigious events in the city, and I had spent weeks preparing. My burgundy silk gown from Saks, the pearl earrings Marcus had given me for our 3rd anniversary, the delicate updo that had taken 2 hours at the salon. Every detail had been perfect. Marcus had even complimented my appearance as we left our Manhattan apartment, though I noticed he seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly. "You look beautiful tonight, Rebecca," he had said, but his eyes were already elsewhere, scanning the room as we entered the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel. At the time, I attributed his restlessness to work stress. Marcus Rivera was a senior partner at Blackstone Financial Advisors, and the pressure of managing high-net-worth clients was always intense. The gala itself had been a blur of networking and small talk. I moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a corporate wife, making conversation with clients' spouses, remembering names and personal details, playing the role I had perfected over our 6 years of marriage. Marcus had trained me well in the art of being an asset to his career: charming but not overpowering, intelligent but deferential, beautiful but not distractingly so. "Rebecca, you remember Charlotte Wilson from the Peterson Group," Marcus would say, his hand on my lower back guiding me through conversations like a choreographed dance. I would smile, engage, and gracefully extract personal information that Marcus could use later to strengthen business relationships. It was a partnership that had served us both well, or so I had thought. The first sign that something was wrong came during the silent auction portion of the evening. Marcus had bid aggressively on a weekend getaway to the Hamptons, something completely out of character for a man who typically calculated every expenditure down to the penny. When I quietly questioned the wisdom of the bid, given our recent discussions about scaling back luxury expenses, he snapped at me with an irritation that drew stares from nearby tables. "Can you please just trust my judgment for once, Rebecca?" he hissed, his voice low but sharp enough to make me flinch. "Not everything needs your input." I spent the rest of the evening in a state of confused hurt, trying to understand what I had done wrong. Marcus continued to work the room, but I noticed he was increasingly gravitating toward a particular group that included Vivian Chen, a striking woman in her early 30s who worked in mergers and acquisitions. Vivian was everything I wasn't: ambitious in an obvious way, sharp-edged, the type of woman who commanded attention rather than quietly supporting others. As the evening wound down, Marcus announced that he needed to stay for additional networking. "Important conversations happening," he explained, already moving away from me. "You should head home, you look tired." The dismissal stung, but I was accustomed to Marcus's single-minded focus on business. I gathered my evening bag and coat, kissed him goodbye on the cheek, and made my way to the hotel exit. It was only when I reached the street that I realized I had no way to get home. Marcus had driven us to the subway station earlier, and our car was parked there, but he had the keys. I called him, but it went straight to voicemail. Twice. Then a text: "Take the subway back. Car keys are in the office safe. We'll get them tomorrow." Standing on the sidewalk in my evening gown, watching other couples disappear into waiting cars and taxis, I felt the first real crack in the foundation of my marriage. Marcus had left me stranded, but more than that, he had done so casually, without consideration for my comfort or safety. The man who once insisted on walking me to my car after late dinners had just abandoned me in the middle of Manhattan at midnight. The subway ride home was a humiliation in itself. The late-night crowd stared openly at the overdressed woman clutching her beaded purse and trying to keep her silk dress from touching the grimy seats. I felt like an actress who had wandered onto the wrong stage, completely out of place and increasingly aware that the performance of my marriage was falling apart. But the true devastation came the following evening, when Marcus suggested we attend the opening of a new art gallery in Soho. Again, he insisted on taking the subway, and again I complied without questioning his sudden enthusiasm for public transportation. The gallery opening was another networking event, though smaller and more intimate than the charity gala. I should have noticed the way Marcus's attention kept drifting to his phone throughout the evening. I should have questioned why he seemed so familiar with the gallery owner, a woman named Patricia Reeves, who clearly knew more about Marcus's schedule than I did. But I was still operating under the assumption that we were a team, that his success was our success, that the occasional dismissive comment or moment of inattention was simply the price of being married to an ambitious man. The devastating blow came as we were leaving the gallery. Marcus had been unusually quiet during the walk back to the subway station, and when we reached the platform, he suddenly turned to me with an expression I had never seen before, cold, calculating, and strangely relieved. "Rebecca, we need to talk," he said, but his tone suggested this wasn't going to be a conversation. "I've realized something important over the past few months. I'm not happy. We're not happy. This marriage isn't working anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. We were standing on the subway platform in the middle of February, the temperature dropping and the first drops of what would become a freezing rain beginning to fall, and my husband was ending our marriage as casually as he might cancel a dinner reservation. "What are you talking about?" I managed to say, my voice barely audible over the sound of an approaching train. "Marcus, if there's a problem, we can work through it. We can get counseling. We can—" "No," he interrupted, and I saw Vivian Chen emerging from the gallery exit behind him, her coat collar turned up against the wind. "I've already made my decision. I've been thinking about this for months, and I deserve to be with someone who understands my ambitions, someone who challenges me professionally." The train that had been approaching wasn't ours. As it pulled away, leaving us alone on the increasingly wet platform, Marcus continued his prepared speech. He talked about needing space to figure things out, about how we had grown in different directions, about how he couldn't be the husband I deserved. All the classic lines delivered without emotion, as if he were presenting a business proposal rather than destroying our life together. "I'll stay at the club for a few weeks while we sort out the details," he said, already backing away toward the exit where Vivian was waiting with barely concealed impatience. "My lawyer will be in touch about the arrangements." And then he was gone, leaving me standing alone on the platform as the freezing rain intensified. I watched him walk away with Vivian, saw them disappear into the warm interior of a waiting Mercedes. Our Mercedes, the car I had helped him choose, had sat in during countless drives to dinner parties and weekend getaways. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through my wool coat and chilling me to the bone. Other commuters huddled under the minimal shelter of the platform roof, but I stood frozen in the middle of the platform, trying to process what had just happened. 6 years of marriage, gone in 5 minutes of corporate speak and casual cruelty. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment I hoped it was Marcus, calling back to say he had made a terrible mistake, that he wanted to come home and work things out. Instead, it was from an unknown number. "Mrs. Rivera, this is Bradley Morrison from Morrison & Associates. I represent your husband in matrimonial matters. Please contact my office Monday morning to discuss proceedings. Thank you." Even his lawyer had been prepared in advance. Even the text message had been scheduled and sent while I was still standing in the rain, still processing the words that had ended my marriage. The level of calculation was breathtaking. As I finally forced myself to move, to find shelter and figure out how to get home to an apartment that might not even be mine anymore, I felt something inside me change. The shocked hurt was still there, the pain of betrayal and abandonment, but underneath it was something else. Something cold and focused and entirely new. Marcus had orchestrated this moment carefully, choosing a public place where I couldn't make a scene, timing it so that I would be stranded and vulnerable while he drove away with his new life already in motion. He had planned my humiliation as meticulously as he planned his business presentations. But Marcus had made one crucial error in his calculations. He assumed I would remain the same grateful, accommodating woman who had supported his career for 6 years. He assumed I would quietly accept whatever settlement his lawyer offered and fade gracefully into the background of his success story. Standing there in the freezing rain watching the taillights of my own car disappear into the night, I made a decision that would change everything. Marcus Rivera had just taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Never underestimate the woman you leave behind. The woman he had abandoned on that subway platform was about to become someone he wouldn't recognize, someone who would make him deeply regret the night he chose cruelty over compassion, calculation over kindness. The rain might have been freezing, but inside me something was beginning to burn with a heat that would sustain me through everything that was coming. As I finally made my way to the subway entrance, my soaked hair dripping and my ruined dress clinging to my shivering frame, I was already planning. The supportive wife was gone, dissolved in the freezing rain. In her place stood a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Marcus thought he had written the ending to our story that night on the platform. He was wrong. He had simply written the opening chapter of mine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The apartment felt like a crime scene when I finally made it home that night. Every familiar object, the leather sofa we'd chosen together, the wedding photos on the mantel, the coffee mug Marcus had left in the sink that morning, now served as evidence of a life that had been systematically dismantled without my knowledge. I stood dripping in our foyer, my ruined dress leaving puddles on the hardwood floors we'd refinished just 2 years ago, and began to see the signs I'd been too trusting to notice. The first revelation came when I tried to access our joint bank account to order a car service. My card was declined. Not just declined, the account had been frozen. I tried our savings account, then our emergency credit line, all frozen or closed. Marcus hadn't just planned his exit strategy, he had been executing it for weeks, maybe months, while I continued playing the role of devoted wife. I sat on our bed in my damp clothes, laptop open, systematically discovering the scope of his betrayal. The mortgage on our apartment was 3 months behind. Our investment accounts had been liquidated. The credit cards in my name had been canceled. Marcus had financially excommunicated me from my own life with surgical precision. But the most devastating discovery came when I accessed my email and found a message dated earlier that evening, sent automatically while I was still standing on that platform. Notice of lease termination. 30-day notice required. Marcus had already given notice on our apartment, effective immediately. I wasn't just losing my husband, I was losing my home, my financial security, and apparently my entire existence as Rebecca Rivera. The woman Marcus had left on that platform would have called her sister crying, would have begged him to reconsider, would have accepted whatever scraps his lawyer offered just to avoid the public humiliation of a contested divorce. But something fundamental had shifted in those freezing minutes on the subway platform. The rain had washed away more than just my carefully styled hair and expensive dress. It had stripped away the illusion that I could trust anyone else to secure my future. I spent that night methodically documenting everything. Every bank statement I could access, every email about joint investments, every text message that might prove his calculated abandonment was premeditated. By dawn, I had compiled a comprehensive file of our financial history and his systematic dismantling of our shared assets. Marcus thought he was dealing with the same compliant woman who had spent 6 years managing his social calendar and hosting his clients. He was about to discover his fatal miscalculation. The phone started ringing at 7 a.m., first my sister Jessica, then my mother, then Marcus's own mother asking if I knew why he wasn't answering his phone. The speed at which news traveled in our social circle was both humiliating and strategically useful. By noon, I had received 17 sympathy calls and learned that Marcus had already been seen at brunch with Vivian Chen, openly holding hands at the Plaza Hotel. The man who had abandoned me 12 hours earlier was already flaunting his new relationship. But the call that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Dr. Helena Blackwood, a client whose portfolio I had helped Marcus secure 2 years earlier, called not to offer sympathy but to make an offer. "Rebecca, I heard about Marcus's appalling behavior," she said without preamble. Helena was worth approximately $40 million and had never been one for small talk. "I want you to know that several of us are reconsidering our business relationships with Blackstone Financial. But more importantly, I have a proposition for you." Dr. Blackwood had built her fortune through medical device patents and strategic real estate investments. She was also, I was about to learn, a woman who recognized potential when she saw it. "I've watched you work a room for the past 2 years," she continued. "You remember every personal detail, you understand people's motivations, and you have an intuitive grasp of social dynamics that most people spend decades trying to develop. You've been wasting those talents playing supportive wife to a man who clearly doesn't deserve them." She offered me a position as her personal consultant, helping her navigate the social and business networks that came with her wealth. The salary she mentioned was more than I had ever earned in my life, but more importantly, it came with something I desperately needed: independence. "There's one condition," Dr. Blackwood added. "You can't just disappear and rebuild quietly. Marcus has publicly humiliated you, and in our circles that kind of treatment sets a precedent. If you don't respond appropriately, every man at the country club will think he can discard his wife when a younger model comes along. You need to make a statement." That afternoon, I found myself in Helena's penthouse office overlooking Central Park, signing contracts that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life. But the real transformation began when she introduced me to her team of advisors: a wealth management specialist, a personal stylist, a social media strategist, and most intriguingly, a woman named Catherine Walsh, who had built an empire helping affluent women reinvent themselves after major life transitions. "The first rule of reinvention," Catherine explained as we sat in Helena's living room with its floor-to-ceiling views of the city, "is that you can't just become someone new. You have to become someone better than the person who wronged you ever imagined you could be. Marcus sees you as a supporting character in his story. We're going to make you the protagonist of yours." The makeover wasn't just cosmetic, though the physical transformation was dramatic. Helena's stylist, a sharp-eyed woman named Miranda Torres, took one look at my conservative corporate wife wardrobe and declared it a monument to self-effacement. "You've been dressing to fade into the background," she said, pulling clothes from my closet with the enthusiasm of someone clearing out a condemned building. "You're beautiful, you're intelligent, and you've been hiding both under beige cardigans and sensible shoes. That ends today." What replaced my old wardrobe was a carefully curated collection of power pieces that announced rather than apologized, deep jewel tones that brought out my dark hair and olive skin, tailored silhouettes that emphasized the figure I'd been hiding under loose-fitting dresses, and accessories that spoke of confidence rather than conformity. But the real work was mental and strategic. Catherine introduced me to a concept she called social jujitsu, using an opponent's strength and momentum against them. Marcus's strength was his network, his reputation, and his assumption that I would quietly disappear. We were going to turn all three into weapons. "He's counting on you being ashamed," Catherine explained. "He wants you to hide, to avoid the places where you might encounter him and his new girlfriend. Instead, we're going to make sure you're everywhere he looks, but transformed into someone he barely recognizes." The first test came 3 days later at the Wellington Club's monthly charity luncheon, an event I had attended as Marcus's wife for 4 years. My instinct was to avoid it, to stay home and nurse my wounds privately. Instead, I arrived alone, wearing a striking emerald dress that hugged my curves and commanded attention, my hair styled in a sophisticated updo that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped as I entered the dining room, not because of pity or scandal, but because I looked like a completely different person. The mousy, accommodating Rebecca Rivera had been replaced by someone who belonged in this room, not as anyone's accessory, but in her own right. "Rebecca," gasped Margaret Whitfield, the club president, rushing over with barely concealed curiosity. "You look absolutely stunning. How are you holding up, dear?" The question was loaded with expectation. She wanted tears, vulnerability, perhaps some bitter comments about Marcus that she could relay to the rest of the social circle. Instead, I smiled with genuine warmth and delivered the response Catherine and I had carefully crafted. "I'm doing wonderfully, thank you for asking. Sometimes life gives you exactly what you need, even when it doesn't look like what you expected." I touched the diamond pendant at my throat, a new piece that Helena had insisted on buying for me. "I'm discovering there's tremendous freedom in being accountable only to yourself." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in controlled information warfare. I mentioned my new position with Dr. Blackwood. Impressive. I discussed my plans to travel to Europe for business. Enviable. I asked about Margaret's daughter's wedding plans and remembered that her husband was considering a new investment property, valuable social currency. Never once did I mention Marcus or appear anything other than gracefully confident. The real victory came when I spotted Vivian Chen across the room, clearly uncomfortable and out of place among the established social hierarchy of the club. She was overdressed and overeager, making the classic mistake of trying too hard to fit into a world that prized subtle confidence over obvious ambition. When our eyes met, I raised my wine glass in a small, acknowledging toast, then turned back to my conversation without another glance. By the time I left the luncheon 2 hours later, I had received 4 dinner invitations, 3 requests for charitable event planning, and the beginning of what would become my new social and professional network. More importantly, I had sent a clear message to everyone in our mutual circle. Rebecca Rivera was not retreating. She was advancing. That evening, Helena called to check on my progress. "How did it feel?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. The old Rebecca would have been exhausted by the performance aspect of the afternoon, drained by having to pretend strength she didn't feel. But this version of myself hadn't been pretending. For the first time in years, possibly ever, I had been completely authentic, strong, confident, and absolutely clear about my worth. "It felt like coming home," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "Good," Helena replied, "because tomorrow we start the real work. Marcus thinks he's won by discarding you. He has no idea he's just given you the greatest gift of your life, the chance to become who you were always meant to be." As I hung up the phone and looked around the hotel suite Helena had arranged for me while I searched for a new apartment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the future. Marcus had tried to write me out of the story. Instead, he had just handed me the pen. 6 weeks after the subway platform incident, I was sitting in the back of Helena's Bentley, reviewing client portfolios on my tablet, when my phone buzzed with a text from my sister Jessica. "Marcus just showed up at Mom's house asking where you're living." Looked desperate. "Should I be worried?" I smiled, typing back. "Not worried. Informed." The fact that Marcus was actively seeking information about my whereabouts meant our strategy was working. A man who was confident in his decision to discard his wife wouldn't be checking up on her through family members. He was beginning to realize that I hadn't simply vanished into quiet obscurity as he'd expected. My new life had a rhythm that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who had once organized her days around Marcus's schedule. My mornings began at 5:30 a.m. with a personal trainer Helena had recommended, a former Olympic athlete named Derek, who specialized in building not just physical strength but mental resilience. The workouts were punishing, but I emerged from each session feeling more capable of handling whatever challenges the day might bring. By 7 a.m., I was in Helena's office, a stunning space that occupied the entire top floor of a Park Avenue building she owned. My role as her personal consultant had evolved rapidly beyond what either of us had initially envisioned. Within weeks, I was managing her social calendar, vetting potential business partners, and serving as her representative in negotiations where my background in reading people and situations proved invaluable. "You have a gift for seeing what people don't want you to see," Helena observed during one of our weekly strategy sessions. "Marcus trained you to be observant in service of his ambitions. Now we're redirecting that skill for your own purposes." The transformation wasn't just professional. Catherine Walsh had introduced me to a network of women who had rebuilt their lives after devastating setbacks, divorce, business failures, public scandals, and emerged stronger than before. These weren't just support group meetings. They were masterclasses in strategic thinking taught by women who had turned their lowest moments into launching pads for unprecedented success. "Revenge is a luxury you can't afford," explained Victoria Chen, a tech entrepreneur who had lost everything in a bitter divorce only to build a company worth more than her ex-husband's entire net worth. "What you need is irrelevance. You need to become so successful, so fulfilled, so obviously better off without him, that his opinion of you becomes meaningless." But irrelevance, I was learning, required a careful period of very strategic relevance. Marcus needed to see exactly what he had lost before I could afford to dismiss him entirely. And the perfect opportunity presented itself when Helena received an invitation to the Spring Gala for Arts Education, the most prestigious charitable event of the social season. "Marcus will be there," Helena mentioned casually as she handed me the elegantly embossed invitation. "He's on the planning committee. Vivian Chen will likely be his date." I studied the invitation, noting the list of corporate sponsors and board members. Blackstone Financial was prominently featured, which meant this event was important to Marcus professionally as well as socially. It would be his first major public appearance with Vivian as his official companion, his chance to establish their relationship as legitimate rather than scandalous. "Then we need to make sure I'm impossible to ignore," I replied, already formulating a plan that would require careful coordination and perfect timing. Catherine and I spent the next 2 weeks crafting what she called the reveal. This wouldn't be about creating a scene or causing drama. Such tactics would only reinforce the narrative that I was bitter and unstable. Instead, we would demonstrate that the woman Marcus had discarded had transformed into someone he could never have imagined. The dress was the centerpiece of our strategy. Miranda Torres worked with a designer to create a custom gown that was nothing short of breathtaking, midnight blue silk that seemed to capture and reflect light with every movement, cut to emphasize the figure I had been sculpting with Derek's relentless training regimen. The neckline was elegant but commanding, the silhouette classic but unmistakably contemporary. But the real transformation wasn't external. Helena had enrolled me in an intensive business course at Columbia, where I was learning about wealth management, international investments, and the kind of financial strategies that Marcus had always dismissed as too complex for me to understand. My evenings were spent studying market trends and economic theory, building the knowledge base I would need to become truly independent. "Education is the ultimate revenge," Helena said when I showed her my first set of perfect test scores. "Every skill you acquire, every connection you make, every success you achieve becomes evidence that he held you back rather than supported you." The night of the gala, I felt a calm confidence I had never experienced before. As Helena's Bentley pulled up to the Metropolitan Museum of Art where the event was being held, I caught my reflection in the window and barely recognized myself. The woman looking back had presence, authority, and an unmistakable aura of success. "Remember," Helena said, as her driver opened our door, "you're not attending this event as Marcus Rivera's ex-wife. You're attending as my business partner and one of the most influential social consultants in the city. Act accordingly." The red carpet entrance was deliberately dramatic. Helena and I arrived fashionably late, ensuring that most of the guests were already inside. The photographers snapped pictures as we posed together. Two successful women who commanded attention and respect. I knew Marcus was somewhere inside, probably near the entrance where planning committee members greeted major donors, which meant he would see me within minutes of my arrival. The reaction inside the museum was everything Catherine had predicted. Conversations paused as I moved through the crowd, not because of whispered gossip about my divorce, but because I was genuinely striking. The months of training, the perfect dress, the confidence that came from knowing I was building something meaningful, all of it combined to create a presence that was undeniably magnetic. "Rebecca Rivera," exclaimed Jonathan Summers, the museum's chief curator, rushing over with obvious delight. "Helena mentioned you might be here tonight. I've been hoping to meet you. We've heard incredible things about your work." This was Helena's influence at work. She had spent weeks strategically mentioning my name in conversations with influential people, positioning me not as a divorced woman seeking sympathy, but as a rising force in the social and business world. By the time I arrived at the gala, I already had a reputation that preceded me. The first test came when I spotted Marcus across the Grand Hall, standing with Vivian near a display of impressionist paintings. He was wearing his favorite tuxedo, the one I had helped him select for our first charity gala as a married couple. Vivian looked beautiful but nervous, clearly aware that she was being evaluated by a room full of people who had known Marcus's previous wife. When Marcus saw me, his champagne glass actually slipped from his hand. I watched from across the room as he fumbled to catch it, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and something that looked disturbingly like regret. This wasn't the broken, desperate woman he had expected to encounter. This was someone he had never met before. I didn't approach them. Instead, I continued my conversation with Jonathan about a potential collaboration between Helena's foundation and the museum's education programs. I laughed genuinely at his stories, engaged thoughtfully with his ideas, and demonstrated the kind of intellectual curiosity that had always been part of me but had been overshadowed by my role as Marcus's supporting player. "You have such insight into cultural programming," Jonathan said, clearly impressed. "Have you considered serving on our advisory board? We're always looking for people who understand both the artistic and business sides of our mission." I accepted the invitation graciously, knowing that Marcus could hear every word from his position just steps away. The woman he had dismissed as lacking professional ambition was being courted for prestigious volunteer positions. The wife he had considered intellectually limited was discussing complex cultural and economic theories with museum leadership. The evening's crescendo came during the auction portion of the event. Helena had prepped me for this moment, explaining that charitable giving at these events was as much about social positioning as philanthropy. When the auctioneer presented a week-long art tour of Florence, something Marcus and I had always talked about doing but never prioritized, I raised my paddle with quiet confidence. The bidding escalated quickly, but I remained calm and strategic, raising my paddle at precisely the right moments to signal serious intent without appearing desperate. When the hammer fell at $35,000, more than I had ever spent on anything in my entire marriage, I felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the vacation itself. "Congratulations, Miss Rivera," the auctioneer announced. "The Florence Art Tour goes to paddle number 47. The applause that followed was genuine and warm. I had just demonstrated not only my newfound financial independence but my commitment to the causes this community valued. More importantly, I had done so with a grace and confidence that made it clear this wasn't a desperate attempt to prove anything. It was simply who I had become. As I made my way to the registration table to complete the purchase, I passed within feet of Marcus and Vivian. Marcus's face was pale, his expression unreadable. Vivian looked uncomfortable, clearly aware that something significant had just happened but uncertain about its implications. "Rebecca," Marcus said quietly as I passed, the first word he had spoken to me since that night on the subway platform. I turned to face him with a polite smile, the kind I might give to any acquaintance at a social event. "Hello, Marcus, Vivian." I nodded to both of them with equal courtesy. "I hope you're enjoying the evening. The museum has outdone themselves." Before he could respond, Helena appeared at my side. "Ready for dinner, darling? I want to introduce you to the Vanderbilt Foundation representatives. They're very interested in discussing a potential partnership." As we walked away together, I heard Vivian ask Marcus in a sharp whisper, "Who was that woman?" She looked familiar, but I didn't hear his response, but I didn't need to. The question itself was the answer. The woman Marcus had abandoned on a subway platform had become someone even his new girlfriend couldn't immediately recognize, someone successful enough, confident enough, and undeniably impressive enough to command respect in rooms where Marcus himself was just another face in the crowd. That night, as Helena's driver took me back to my new apartment in Tribeca, a stunning space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Hudson River, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with Marcus's obvious discomfort. I had spent the evening being genuinely myself for the first time in years, engaging with people who valued my mind and my contributions rather than my ability to support someone else's ambitions. The woman Marcus had discarded was gone, not destroyed but transformed into someone infinitely more interesting. And this was just the beginning. 3 months after the gala, Marcus was losing clients. The information came to me through Helena's vast network of connections, delivered casually during our morning briefing as if it were just another piece of market intelligence. But I knew better. Nothing in Helena's world was ever casual, and this particular piece of information was being shared for a very specific reason. The Westmont Group pulled their portfolio from Blackstone Financial last week, she mentioned while reviewing the morning's financial reports. Apparently, they weren't satisfied with the level of personal attention they were receiving. They've moved their assets to Goldman Sachs. The Westmont Group represented a $12 million account, one that Marcus had personally cultivated for 3 years. Their defection would be both a financial blow and a professional humiliation, especially since everyone in the industry would know about it within days. "Interesting timing," I replied, keeping my voice neutral while my mind processed the implications. "Any particular reason for their dissatisfaction?" Helena's smile was barely perceptible. "Richard Westmont mentioned something about feeling disconnected from his advisor. Said Marcus seemed distracted lately, missing important details in their quarterly reviews. Poor focus can be career-ending in wealth management." This was the beauty of Helena's approach to what she called strategic consequences. We weren't actively sabotaging Marcus's career. We didn't need to. His own choices were creating the instability, and Helena's network was simply responding naturally to his declining performance. A distracted advisor who was more interested in his new relationship than his professional responsibilities would inevitably lose clients. We were just ensuring that the process happened more efficiently. My own career trajectory was moving in the opposite direction entirely. What had started as a consulting position with Helena had evolved into something much more significant. She had introduced me to venture capital, impact investing, and the complex world of foundation management. Within weeks, I was reviewing investment proposals, conducting due diligence on potential partnerships, and representing Helena's interests in high-level negotiations. "You have an intuitive understanding of risk assessment that most MBA graduates never develop," observed David Chen, Helena's financial advisor during a particularly complex merger discussion. "It's remarkable how quickly you've mastered concepts that typically take years to internalize." The truth was that Marcus had unknowingly trained me for this work. Years of listening to his phone calls, reviewing his presentations, and helping him prepare for client meetings had given me a comprehensive education in financial strategy. I had absorbed the knowledge passively then, storing it away without realizing its value. Now I was applying it actively, with a clarity and confidence that surprised even Helena. But the real turning point came when I received an unexpected phone call from someone I hadn't heard from in months. Patricia Reeves, the gallery owner who had been so friendly with Marcus at the Soho opening. Her voice was strained, almost apologetic, as she explained the reason for her call. "Rebecca, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. I got your number from Helena Blackwood's office. I have a rather delicate situation, and I was hoping you might be able to help." Patricia's gallery was facing a financial crisis. A major investor had pulled out at the last minute, leaving her unable to complete the purchase of a collection that would have secured her reputation in the contemporary art world. She needed someone with connections to private collectors and the expertise to structure a complex acquisition deal. "I know this is awkward given everything that happened," she continued, clearly uncomfortable. "But Helena mentioned that you're doing remarkable work in investment consulting, and frankly, you're the only person I know who might be able to help." The irony was exquisite. Patricia Reeves, who had facilitated Marcus's connection with Vivian Chen, was now asking me for professional assistance. But more than irony, this represented an opportunity to demonstrate just how far I had come from the woman Marcus had discarded. I agreed to meet with Patricia the following afternoon, not out of any desire for revenge but because the project genuinely interested me. Contemporary art investment was an area Helena had been encouraging me to explore. And Patricia's gallery specialized in emerging artists whose work had significant appreciation potential. The meeting took place in Patricia's gallery, the same space where Marcus had been so attentive to Vivian just months earlier. But the woman who walked into that gallery bore little resemblance to the uncertain, overlooked wife who had attended the opening. I arrived in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of serious business, carrying a leather portfolio that contained preliminary research on the artists in question and a detailed analysis of the contemporary art market. "Rebecca," Patricia said, rising from her desk with obvious relief, "thank you so much for coming. I wasn't sure if you would, given the circumstances." I took the seat across from her with the calm confidence I had developed through months of high-stakes negotiations. "The past is the past, Patricia. I'm here because Helena thinks this could be a mutually beneficial opportunity. Tell me about the collection." For the next 2 hours we discussed the intricacies of art acquisition, market trends, and investment structures. I found myself drawing on knowledge I had gained through Helena's network, combining it with intuitive insights about value and potential that surprised both of us. By the end of our meeting, I had outlined a financing structure that would allow Patricia to acquire the collection while providing Helena's investment group with a promising return. "This is brilliant," Patricia said, reviewing my preliminary proposal. "The way you've structured the risk assessment and the potential for appreciation. Marcus always said you were smart, but I don't think any of us realized just how smart." The mention of Marcus's name hung in the air for a moment, but I didn't flinch. "Marcus saw what he needed to see," I replied simply. "People often underestimate what they don't take the time to truly understand." As I left the gallery that afternoon, I felt a satisfaction that went beyond the successful meeting. I had just demonstrated mastery of a field I had never formally studied, using skills I had developed entirely on my own merit. The woman Marcus had dismissed as intellectually limited had just structured $1 million art acquisition deal. But the real validation came the following week, when Helena called me into her office with news that would fundamentally alter my professional trajectory. "The Patterson Foundation wants to offer you a position," she announced without preamble. "Director of Strategic Investments, reporting directly to the board. It's a role they created specifically for you after watching your work on the gallery project." The Patterson Foundation was one of the most prestigious philanthropic organizations in the country, with an endowment that rivaled many universities. A director-level position there would place me among the most influential women in New York's nonprofit sector. "The salary is 7 figures, Helena continued, plus equity participation in their venture investments. You'd be overseeing a portfolio worth approximately $200 million. I absorbed this information with the calm demeanor I had cultivated, but internally I was marveling at the trajectory of my transformation. 6 months earlier, I had been financially dependent on a man who had systematically dismantled our joint assets. Now I was being offered a position that would make me independently wealthy while doing work that genuinely excited me. There's one condition, Helena added with a smile that suggested she had saved the best for last. They want you to present your investment philosophy to their board next week. It's a formality, but they'd like to see you in action before making the final offer. The presentation took place in the Patterson Foundation's boardroom, an elegant space overlooking Central Park where 12 of the most influential philanthropists in the country gathered monthly to direct millions of dollars in strategic giving. As I stood before them clicking through slides that outlined my approach to impact investing and sustainable wealth creation, I felt a profound sense of belonging that I had never experienced during my years as Marcus's wife. "Rivera," said Eleanor Patterson herself, the foundation's founder and chairwoman, after I had concluded my presentation, "your approach to balancing financial returns with social impact is exactly what we've been looking for. When can you start?" I accepted the position immediately, knowing that this moment represented the completion of my transformation from discarded wife to respected professional, but the sweetest validation came 2 days later, when Jessica called with news from our family dinner. "Marcus showed up at Mom's again," she reported with barely concealed amusement. "He's been asking questions about your new job, your apartment, even your social life. Mom finally told him that you're doing better than anyone expected, and that maybe he should focus on his own situation instead of yours." The fact that Marcus was actively seeking information about my life meant that my transformation was having exactly the impact Helena had predicted. A man who was confident in his decision to end our marriage wouldn't be checking up on his ex-wife's career progress. His curiosity suggested something else entirely, the growing realization that he might have made a catastrophic error in judgment. "What did he say to that?" I asked, genuinely curious about Marcus's state of mind. "That's the interesting part," Jessica replied. "He didn't argue or get defensive, he just looked defeated. And then he asked Mom if she thought you would ever speak to him again." I hung up the phone and walked to my apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city where I was building a life that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. Marcus was beginning to understand what he had lost, but more importantly, I was beginning to understand what I had gained. The woman he had abandoned on that subway platform had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed. His cruelty had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the opportunity to find out who I really was when I wasn't trying to be what someone else needed me to be. And I was just getting started. 7 months after that freezing night on the subway platform, I was sitting in the back of a Rolls-Royce Phantom, returning from a board meeting in Greenwich where I had just secured $40 million in funding for sustainable housing initiatives across 3 states. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now regularly traveling in vehicles that cost more than Marcus's annual salary, while he was reportedly struggling to maintain his lease payments on his aging Mercedes. The call came just as we were approaching Manhattan. My assistant, Sarah Chen, a brilliant Harvard MBA who had specifically requested to work with me after hearing about my investment philosophy, handed me my phone with an expression of barely contained amusement. "It's Marcus Rivera," she said quietly. "He's called the office 4 times today trying to reach you directly." I stared at the phone for a moment, genuinely surprised. In all the months since our divorce had been finalized, Marcus had maintained complete silence. No attempts at contact, no messages through mutual friends, nothing. His sudden urgency to speak with me suggested something significant had changed in his circumstances. "Should I tell him you're unavailable?" Sarah asked, clearly prepared to shield me from any potential unpleasantness. I considered this carefully. The old Rebecca might have taken the call immediately, desperate to know what Marcus wanted, hoping against hope that he was calling to apologize or express regret. But the woman I had become understood the value of strategic timing. Whatever Marcus needed from me, letting him wait would only strengthen my position. "Tell him I'll be available Thursday afternoon at 3, I said finally. "He can schedule a meeting through proper channels like any other business appointment." Sarah nodded with approval. We had discussed this possibility during my media training sessions, how to handle eventual contact from Marcus with the professionalism and boundaries that reflected my new status. The key was to treat him exactly as I would any other person seeking my time, with courtesy but without accommodation for his convenience. The reason for Marcus's desperation became clear the following morning, when Helena forwarded me an article from the Financial Tribune with obvious satisfaction. The headline read, "Blackstone Financial faces SEC investigation over client asset management irregularities." The article detailed a formal investigation into the firm's handling of several high-net-worth accounts, including allegations of unauthorized transfers and inadequate risk disclosure. While no individuals were named specifically, sources within the industry suggested that several senior partners were under scrutiny for potential violations of fiduciary duty. "Marcus is in serious trouble," Helena observed during our morning strategy session. "The SEC doesn't launch investigations lightly, and Blackstone's stock has dropped 18% since the announcement. Several major clients have already initiated transfers to other firms." I read through the article carefully, noting the specific allegations and timeline. The investigation seemed to center on practices that had been standard during my marriage to Marcus: aggressive investment strategies that prioritized short-term gains over long-term stability, inadequate disclosure of risks to clients, and a corporate culture that rewarded results over ethics. "Is this related to the Westridge Capital situation?" I asked, remembering the questionable client Helena had mentioned months earlier. "Among other things," Helena replied with a knowing smile. "It turns out that when you build a career on cutting corners and prioritizing profits over people, those choices eventually compound into very serious consequences. But the real revelation came that afternoon, when I received an unexpected visitor at the Patterson Foundation offices. Eleanor Patterson herself knocked on my office door, carrying a file folder and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "Rebecca, I have something extraordinary to share with you," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "We've just received a proposal that I think will interest you greatly." The proposal was from the Metropolitan Development Corporation, a consortium of investors who were planning the largest urban renewal project in New York's history. They wanted the Patterson Foundation to serve as the ethical oversight committee for a $15 billion development that would create affordable housing, green spaces, and community resources across 3 boroughs. "They've specifically requested that you serve as the lead consultant," Eleanor explained. "Apparently your work on the Sustainable Housing Initiative has caught the attention of some very influential people in urban planning." The scope of the project was breathtaking. We would be overseeing the development of sustainable communities that could serve as models for urban renewal across the country. The financial complexity alone would require every skill I had developed, while the social impact potential aligned perfectly with my growing passion for meaningful philanthropy. "There's one interesting detail," Eleanor added with a smile that suggested she had saved the best for last. "The project will require us to work closely with several financial advisory firms to structure the investment vehicles. Blackstone Financial was originally on the list of potential partners." "Originally?" I asked, already anticipating the answer. "They've been removed due to the ongoing SEC investigation. The consortium can't risk association with a firm under regulatory scrutiny, especially for a project of this magnitude and public visibility." The implications were staggering. Marcus's firm wasn't just losing individual clients, they were being excluded from the kind of major projects that defined careers and built reputations. The investigation had effectively blacklisted them from the most prestigious opportunities in the industry. But more than professional satisfaction, I felt a deep sense of cosmic justice. The same aggressive, ethically questionable practices that had funded our lifestyle during our marriage were now destroying Marcus's career. He had built his success on a foundation of sand, and the tide was finally coming in. Thursday afternoon arrived with the inevitability of a long-awaited reckoning. Marcus appeared at the Patterson Foundation precisely at 3, dressed in a suit that I recognized from our marriage but that now seemed slightly rumpled, as if he wasn't maintaining his wardrobe with the same meticulous care. His usually confident posture had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like desperation. Sarah showed him into my office with the professional courtesy she would extend to any visitor, but I noticed her barely perceptible nod, a signal we had arranged to confirm that building security was aware of his presence and ready to intervene if necessary. "Rebecca," Marcus said as he entered, his voice carrying a combination of relief and uncertainty. "Thank you for seeing me, you look incredible." I remained seated behind my desk, a deliberate choice that established the power dynamic immediately. The office itself, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, original artwork and elegant furnishings, served as a visual reminder of how dramatically our circumstances had shifted. "Hello, Marcus," I replied with the same polite professionalism I would offer any business acquaintance. "Please, have a seat. Sarah mentioned you were quite persistent in your attempts to reach me. What can I do for you?" He settled into the chair across from my desk, his eyes taking in the details of my office with obvious amazement. This wasn't the modest workspace of someone rebuilding after a divorce. This was the office of someone who had achieved genuine success and influence. "I wanted to apologize," he began, his voice lacking the confidence that had once characterized every conversation. "For everything. The way I handled our divorce, the subway station, all of it. I was wrong, Rebecca. Completely wrong." I listened without interruption, noting the careful phrasing that suggested he had rehearsed this speech, but beneath the prepared words, I could see genuine distress. This wasn't just about guilt or regret. Marcus was in serious trouble and hoping I might somehow provide assistance. "I appreciate the apology," I said when he finished. "Though I have to ask what's prompted this sudden desire to make amends." Marcus's composure cracked slightly. "You've heard about the investigation," he said, not quite making it a question. "I follow industry news," I replied neutrally. "The Financial Tribune mentioned some regulatory concerns at Blackstone." "It's more than concerns," Marcus said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The SEC is freezing assets, interviewing clients, reviewing every transaction from the past 3 years. The firm might not survive this, Rebecca. My entire career could be over." The desperation in his voice was genuine, and for a moment I felt an echo of the sympathy that had once defined our relationship. But then I remembered standing alone on that subway platform in the freezing rain, watching him drive away with another woman while I faced financial ruin and social humiliation. "I'm sorry to hear you're having difficulties," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure how I can help with a regulatory investigation." "You have connections now," Marcus said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. "Helena Blackwood, the Patterson Foundation, people with real influence. Maybe if someone credible vouched for my character, explained that the investigation is targeting practices that were standard industry procedure." The request hung in the air between us, and I finally understood why he was here. Marcus wasn't just apologizing, he was asking me to use my newfound influence to help salvage his career. The same man who had systematically dismantled our financial security was now hoping I would risk my professional reputation to save him from the consequences of his own choices. "Marcus," I said gently but firmly, "what you're asking is impossible. Even if I wanted to help, which would require a level of forgiveness I haven't achieved, no one with actual influence would jeopardize their reputation to defend someone they don't know against federal regulatory charges." His face fell as the reality of his situation fully registered. "So that's it? You're just going to let me destroy everything I've worked for?" The question revealed everything about how Marcus still viewed our relationship and his circumstances. Even now, facing the collapse of his career due to his own choices, he saw my refusal to rescue him as an active betrayal rather than a natural boundary. "Marcus," I said, standing to signal the end of our meeting, "you destroyed your career when you chose to engage in questionable practices. You destroyed our marriage when you chose to abandon me for another woman. I didn't cause either of those outcomes. I'm simply not preventing their natural consequences." As he left my office that afternoon, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also a profound sadness for the man Marcus could have been if he had chosen differently. The confident, successful husband I had once admired was gone, replaced by someone who couldn't accept responsibility for his own actions, even when facing their inevitable consequences. That evening, as my driver took me home through the city streets where I was building my new life, I reflected on how completely our positions had reversed. 7 months ago, Marcus had held all the power, all the financial control, all the social connections. Now he was begging me for help while I sat in positions of genuine influence and independence. The woman he had discarded had become someone he needed, but could never again reach, and that, more than any revenge I could have planned, felt like perfect justice. 9 months after the subway platform incident, I was preparing for the most important presentation of my career when the news broke that would complete Marcus's professional destruction. The Wall Street Journal's morning edition featured a front-page story with the headline, "Federal prosecutors file criminal charges in Blackstone financial case." I read the article while my stylist worked on my hair in the private suite Helena had reserved at the Plaza Hotel. Today was the public announcement of the Metropolitan Development Project, where I would be introduced as the lead strategic consultant for the largest urban renewal initiative in the city's history. Major news outlets, city officials, and representatives from dozens of investment firms would be present. It was the kind of moment that defined careers and established reputations for decades. But Marcus's criminal indictment cast an unexpected shadow over what should have been my day of triumph. According to the Journal, Federal prosecutors had filed charges of securities fraud, embezzlement, and violation of fiduciary duty against 3 senior partners at Blackstone Financial. While Marcus wasn't named specifically in the article, sources suggested that additional charges were forthcoming. Ironic timing, Helena observed as she reviewed the article over breakfast. The day you're being celebrated as one of the most influential women in New York finance, your ex-husband becomes the face of everything wrong with the industry. I set down the newspaper and focused on the final preparations for my presentation. The woman Marcus had abandoned would have been devastated by this news, would have felt somehow responsible for his downfall, would have wondered if there was anything she could have done to prevent it. But the person I had become understood that Marcus's choices were his own, and their consequences belonged to him entirely. The press conference took place in the grand ballroom of the Marriott Marquis, with representatives from the mayor's office, the Patterson Foundation, and the Metropolitan Development Corporation. As I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included some of the most powerful people in New York's business and political communities, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with Marcus or our failed marriage. The Metropolitan Development Project represents more than urban renewal, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the packed ballroom. It represents a fundamental shift in how we think about community development, environmental sustainability, and social responsibility in urban planning. The presentation went flawlessly. I outlined our 3-phase approach to creating sustainable communities, detailed the innovative financing structures we had developed, and answered questions from reporters and city officials with the confidence that came from months of intensive preparation. When Mayor Patricia Williams personally thanked me for bringing visionary leadership to one of the most important initiatives in our city's history, I felt a professional satisfaction that dwarfed any validation I had received during my marriage. But the real moment of triumph came during the reception that followed, when James Patterson, Eleanor's son and the foundation's vice president, pulled me aside with news that would fundamentally alter my future. "Rebecca, I wanted to speak with you privately before we make any public announcements," he said, guiding me to a quiet corner of the reception. "The foundation's board met this morning, and we voted unanimously to offer you the position of executive director. The executive director position was the most powerful role in one of the country's most influential philanthropic organizations, overseeing an annual budget of nearly $500 million and directing strategic giving initiatives across multiple continents. It was a role that would place me among the most powerful women in international philanthropy." The compensation package reflects the scope of the responsibility, James continued. Base salary of $2 million annually, plus performance bonuses and equity participation in our investment vehicles. You'd also have access to the foundation's private jet, residences in London and Aspen, and a full executive support team. I accepted the position immediately, understanding that this represented the completion of my transformation from abandoned wife to industry leader. But more than the financial security or professional prestige, the role offered something I had discovered I valued above all else: the ability to create meaningful change in the world, while being accountable only to my own conscience and capabilities. The celebration was interrupted by an urgent call from Sarah, who had remained at the Patterson Foundation offices to handle the inevitable media requests following the morning's announcement. "Rebecca, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation you need to know about," she said, her voice tense with concern. "Marcus Rivera is in the lobby. He's been here for over an hour, refusing to leave until he speaks with you. Building security is prepared to remove him, but he's claiming it's a family emergency." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of Marcus's problems trying to intrude on my moment of triumph. Even now, even facing federal criminal charges, he expected immediate access to my time and attention based on nothing more than our former relationship. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I told Sarah. "Have security wait in the lobby, but don't have him removed yet. And Sarah, document everything. Record the conversation if possible." The drive back to my office gave me time to prepare mentally for whatever desperation had driven Marcus to essentially stalk me at my workplace. Helena, who had insisted on accompanying me, used the time to brief me on the legal implications of his federal charges. "If he's been indicted, there are restrictions on what he can and can't do financially," she explained. "His assets will be frozen, his passport confiscated, and he'll be prohibited from making any significant financial decisions without court approval. He's probably facing the complete destruction of his lifestyle and possibly decades in federal prison." When we arrived at the Patterson Foundation, I could see Marcus through the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows, pacing like a caged animal. He had lost weight, his usually immaculate appearance replaced by rumpled clothing and the unmistakable signs of chronic stress. This wasn't the confident, controlling man who had orchestrated my humiliation 9 months earlier. This was someone who had been broken by the consequences of his own choices. "Mrs. Rivera," the security guard approached as I entered the lobby. "He's been increasingly agitated. We're prepared to remove him immediately if you prefer." I looked at Marcus, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in our entire relationship. Without the armor of professional success and financial security, he appeared smaller, more fragile, almost pathetic. The man who had once seemed so powerful and decisive was revealed as someone who had built his entire identity on external validation and material success. "Marcus," I said, approaching him with the same professional courtesy I would extend to any visitor, "I understand you've been waiting to speak with me." He turned toward me with obvious relief, his eyes taking in my tailored suit, the confidence in my posture, the security team that flanked me like a protective detail. For a moment he seemed almost confused, as if he couldn't reconcile this version of me with the woman he remembered. "Rebecca, thank God," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I've been trying to reach you for weeks. The lawyers, the investigators, everyone wants to talk about our marriage, our finances during the time we were together. They're saying I might have involved you in activities that could make you liable for criminal charges too." The desperation in his voice was genuine, but I recognized the manipulation immediately. Marcus was trying to create a shared crisis, a situation where we would be forced to work together against a common threat. It was the same tactic he had used throughout our marriage, creating problems that required my assistance, then positioning himself as the solution. "Marcus, I need you to listen very carefully," I said, maintaining a calm, professional tone despite the gravity of what he was suggesting. "I was never involved in your business decisions during our marriage. I never had access to client accounts, never participated in investment strategies, and never had any role in the financial practices that are currently under investigation." "But the government doesn't know that," he replied, his desperation becoming more apparent. "They're looking at everything, our joint accounts, our tax returns, even the charity donations we made together. My lawyer thinks they might try to implicate you as a way to pressure me into cooperating." I studied his face carefully, noting the practiced sincerity that had once been so convincing. But months of working with truly successful ethical business leaders had taught me to recognize manipulation, even when it was wrapped in apparent concern for my welfare. "What exactly are you asking me to do, Marcus?" He glanced around the lobby, noting the security guards and Helena's imposing presence, then seemed to make a decision to abandon whatever script he had prepared. "I need character witnesses," he said quietly, "people who can testify about my integrity, my commitment to ethical business practices. The prosecutor is painting me as someone who built his career on fraud and deception, but you know that's not true. You lived with me for 6 years. You know I'm not a criminal." The request hung between us like a challenge. Marcus was asking me to risk the reputation and credibility I had spent months building to help him defend against charges that, based on everything I had learned about his business practices, were probably justified. "Marcus," I said gently but firmly, "I can't provide character testimony for business practices I never witnessed. During our marriage, you made it very clear that your professional activities were too complex for me to understand. I trusted your judgment then, but I can't vouch for decisions I wasn't part of making." His face crumpled as the reality of his isolation fully registered. The wife he had dismissed and abandoned was now the only person he could think to turn to for help, but she was also the person least likely to risk everything to save him. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're just going to let them destroy me?" I looked at this man who had once controlled every aspect of my life, who had made me feel small and dependent and grateful for whatever attention he chose to give me. The power dynamic between us had reversed so completely that he was now begging for help from someone he had discarded like unwanted baggage. "Marcus, you destroyed yourself when you chose to prioritize profit over people, when you treated your client's trust as a resource to be exploited, and when you built your success on practices you knew were questionable. I'm not destroying you, I'm simply not saving you from the consequences of your own choices." As I walked away from him toward the elevator, flanked by Helena and the security team, I felt a profound sense of closure. The man who had abandoned me on a subway platform in freezing rain was now the one standing alone, watching me disappear into a life he could never again touch or diminish. The woman he had discarded had become someone he needed but could never deserve. And in that moment, I understood that my transformation was complete. I was no longer defined by what Marcus had done to me, but by what I had chosen to become despite him. The elevator doors closed on his desperate face, and I ascended to the life I had built entirely on my own terms. 11 months after Marcus abandoned me on that subway platform, I was stepping out of my new Rolls-Royce Phantom onto the very same platform where my transformation had begun. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was returning to the scene of my greatest humiliation as arguably one of the most powerful women in New York's philanthropic sector, with a personal driver holding an umbrella against the light rain that had begun to fall. The occasion was a groundbreaking ceremony for the first phase of the Metropolitan Development Project, strategically located adjacent to Central Station to symbolize the connection between transportation infrastructure and community development. Mayor Williams had specifically requested that I arrive by subway to demonstrate the project's commitment to public transportation integration, but my security team had insisted on the Rolls-Royce for the final approach. As photographers captured my arrival, I thought about the woman who had stood on this platform less than a year ago, soaked and shivering, watching her husband disappear into the night with another woman. That version of myself felt like a character from someone else's story. Distant, almost fictional, certainly not the confident executive who now commanded seven-figure budgets and international attention. Miss Rivera, called Rebecca Stone from the New York Times, approaching with her photographer in tow. Could we get a statement about the symbolic significance of returning to this location for today's announcement? I smiled, understanding that this moment was being carefully documented as part of a larger narrative about urban renewal and women's leadership in traditionally male-dominated fields. But beneath the public relations aspect, there was a personal satisfaction in reclaiming this space where I had once felt so powerless. This platform represents more than just transportation infrastructure, I said, my voice carrying clearly despite the ambient noise of the station. It represents connection between communities, between opportunities, between who we were and who we're capable of becoming. The Metropolitan Development Project will create those same kinds of transformative connections for thousands of families across our city. The groundbreaking ceremony itself was flawlessly executed. I stood with Mayor Williams, city council members, and representatives from major investment firms as we officially launched the construction phase of what would become the largest sustainable housing initiative in American history. The speech I delivered focused on the project's potential to serve as a model for cities worldwide, but I couldn't help but think about how different this moment would have been if Marcus had succeeded in destroying my confidence and social standing. The reception following the ceremony took place in the newly renovated community center that would serve as the project's headquarters. As I circulated among the guests, urban planners, environmental engineers, social advocates, and financial leaders, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with Marcus or our failed marriage. This was work that mattered, work that would improve real people's lives, work that justified the skills and resources I had developed. But the perfect morning was interrupted by an urgent call from Helena, who had remained in the city to handle foundation business during the ceremony. "Rebecca, you need to know that Marcus is making one final play," she said without preamble. "He's scheduled a press conference for this afternoon. My sources suggest he's planning to make public statements about your marriage and your current position that could be problematic." I found a quiet corner of the reception area, away from the celebrating crowd, to process this information. Marcus had been increasingly desperate since his criminal charges were filed, but a public press conference suggested he had moved beyond rational decision-making into something approaching self-destruction. "What kind of statements?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "According to his lawyer's office, he's claiming that your current success is built on information and connections you gained improperly during your marriage. He's suggesting that you had more involvement in his business decisions than you've acknowledged, and that your transformation is essentially built on his foundation." The audacity was breathtaking. Marcus was attempting to claim credit for my accomplishments while simultaneously trying to implicate me in his legal troubles. It was a desperate gambit that could destroy both our reputations, but for someone facing decades in federal prison, perhaps that felt like an acceptable outcome. "There's more," Helena continued. "He's apparently prepared to release financial documents from your marriage that he claims show you were actively involved in investment decisions that are now under federal investigation." I closed my eyes, thinking through the implications. Even if Marcus's claims were false, which they were, The mere suggestion of impropriety could be enough to compromise my position with the Patterson Foundation and the Metropolitan Development Project. In the world of high-stakes philanthropy, perception often mattered more than reality. "What do you recommend?" I asked, trusting Helena's strategic instincts completely. "We get ahead of it," she replied immediately. "Full transparency, complete documentation of your role during the marriage and your activities since the divorce. If Marcus wants to play public relations warfare, we make sure you're armed with superior weapons." I spent the remainder of the reception making discreet phone calls to assemble my own crisis management team. Within 2 hours, I had retained the most prestigious public relations firm in the city, compiled comprehensive documentation of my professional activities since the divorce, and prepared a detailed timeline that would demonstrate the independence of my current success. But as I was leaving the reception, something unexpected happened that would change the entire dynamic of Marcus's planned attack. Vivian Chen appeared in the lobby of the community center, looking haggard and desperate in a way that immediately reminded me of Marcus's recent appearances. "Rebecca," she called out as I headed toward my waiting car. "Please, I need to speak with you. It's about Marcus and what he's planning to do." I studied her carefully, noting the expensive clothing that couldn't hide the obvious stress she was experiencing. This was the woman who had stood beside Marcus as he destroyed our marriage, who had benefited from his abandonment of me, who had helped orchestrate my public humiliation. But she also looked genuinely frightened. "You have 5 minutes," I said, gesturing toward a quiet seating area near the building's entrance. Vivian sat across from me with the nervous energy of someone who had rehearsed this conversation multiple times but wasn't sure she had the courage to follow through. "Marcus is planning to lie about you," she said without preamble. "The things he's going to claim about your involvement in his business, they're not true, and I know they're not true because I was there. I handled his communications, I managed his calendar, I knew exactly how much he excluded you from his professional activities." This was unexpected. I had assumed Vivian would support whatever narrative Marcus constructed, both out of loyalty and self-preservation. Her willingness to contradict him suggested something had fundamentally changed in their relationship. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, genuinely curious about her motivation. Vivian's composure cracked slightly. "Because he's destroying everything he touches, including me. The federal investigation isn't just looking at Marcus, they're examining everyone who worked closely with him. My career is over, Rebecca. I'm probably going to face charges too, and it's all because I was stupid enough to think Marcus Rivera was worth sacrificing my integrity for." The bitter irony in her voice was unmistakable. Vivian had gained what she thought she wanted: Marcus's attention, his lifestyle, his social connections, only to discover that all of it was built on practices that would ultimately destroy both of them. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. "I have recordings," she said quietly. "Conversations where Marcus specifically discusses keeping you away from business decisions, where he talks about how naive you are about financial matters, where he laughs about your lack of understanding of his strategies. I also have emails and documents that prove you had no access to client information or investment decisions." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small digital recorder. "This is from last month when he was panicking about the federal investigation. He's explaining to his lawyer how he kept you completely separate from his business activities, specifically to protect you from any potential legal liability." I listened to 30 seconds of the recording, hearing Marcus's voice clearly state that I had been completely compartmentalized from his professional activities and had no knowledge of client strategies or investment methodologies. It was exactly the kind of evidence that would demolish his planned public accusations against me. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked, still puzzled by her motivation. Vivian smiled bitterly. "Because Marcus is planning to throw me under the bus too. His press conference isn't just about implicating you, he's preparing to claim that I manipulated him into making questionable decisions, that I was the mastermind behind the practices that are now under investigation. He's trying to save himself by destroying both of us." The revelation was stunning but not entirely surprising. Marcus had always been willing to sacrifice others to protect himself, and facing federal prison would only intensify that tendency. He had calculated that destroying both his ex-wife and his girlfriend might somehow create enough confusion to save his own reputation. "There's something else," Vivian continued. "The press conference is a bluff. His lawyer advised against it. His publicist quit rather than be associated with it, and he's funding it with money he borrowed from a loan shark because all his legitimate assets are frozen. He's hoping you'll panic and offer him some kind of deal before he goes public." I absorbed this information, understanding that Marcus's final gambit was actually a desperate attempt at extortion. He was betting that the threat of public scandal would force me to use my influence to help him with his legal problems. "What do you want in exchange for this information?" I asked, knowing that Vivian's assistance came with a price. "Nothing from you," she replied, surprising me. "I just want Marcus to understand that he can't destroy innocent people to save himself. You didn't deserve what he did to you during your marriage, and you don't deserve what he's planning to do now." As I left the community center that afternoon, carrying evidence that would completely neutralize Marcus's planned attack, I felt a strange sense of completion. The woman who had once competed for Marcus's attention was now providing me with the tools to defend against his final act of betrayal. The roles had shifted so completely that even his allies were choosing my side over his. Marcus had become so toxic, so destructive, that everyone who had once benefited from association with him was now running for cover. That evening, as I prepared for whatever public relations battle Marcus might launch, I realized that I was no longer fighting to survive his attacks. I was fighting to protect something I had built entirely independent of him: a career, a reputation, and a sense of purpose that belonged to me alone. The woman he had abandoned on that subway platform was gone forever, replaced by someone who could not only defend herself, but had others willing to help her do it. Marcus's final gambit would fail not because I was stronger than his attacks, but because I had become someone worth defending. The morning of Marcus's planned press conference arrived with the dramatic intensity of a thunderstorm brewing over Manhattan. I stood in my corner office at the Patterson Foundation, watching dark clouds gather outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, while my crisis management team made final preparations for what would either be Marcus's complete destruction or his desperate salvation. "The venue is telling," observed Margaret Ross, the crisis communications specialist Helena had recommended. "He's holding it at the Midtown Community Center, somewhere cheap that doesn't require a deposit. His legal team has officially distanced themselves from whatever he's planning to say." I reviewed the comprehensive file we had prepared overnight: documentation of my complete separation from Marcus's business activities, testimonials from Patterson Foundation colleagues about my independent accomplishments, and most damaging to his credibility, Vivian's recordings that directly contradicted every claim he planned to make. "The media strategy is crucial," continued Margaret. "We don't respond to his allegations directly, that would give them legitimacy. Instead, we release a statement about your professional achievements and let the evidence speak for itself." Meanwhile, Vivian's recordings will leak to select journalists about an hour after his press conference begins. The timing was deliberately calculated to maximize Marcus's humiliation. He would make his false accusations in public, creating a temporary sensation, only to have his own words prove him a liar before the news cycle could fully develop. It was a strategy worthy of the corporate warfare Marcus himself had once employed. But as morning turned to afternoon, something unexpected happened that would change the entire trajectory of the day. Sarah knocked on my office door with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Rebecca, you need to see this," she said, handing me her tablet with a breaking news alert. "Marcus isn't going to make it to his press conference." The headline on CNN's website read, "Financial Executive Arrested at Federal Courthouse on Additional Fraud Charges." The accompanying article detailed how Marcus Rivera had been taken into custody while attempting to enter the federal building for a scheduled meeting with prosecutors. Apparently, new evidence had emerged linking him to an offshore money laundering operation that went far beyond the original charges. "The timing is extraordinary," Sarah continued, clearly enjoying the irony. "He was supposed to hold his press conference in 2 hours, but instead he's being processed into federal custody." I read through the article carefully, noting the expansion of charges to include conspiracy, money laundering, and racketeering. These weren't just white-collar financial crimes. These were federal felonies that carried mandatory minimum sentences measured in decades, not years. "There's more," Sarah added, pulling up another news source. "Vivian Chen was arrested at the same time. Apparently, the prosecutors have been building a case against both of them for months." The revelation that Vivian was also facing federal charges cast her assistance to me in an entirely new light. She hadn't been acting out of conscience or regret. She had been trying to save herself by cooperating with what she thought was my investigation into Marcus. The recordings she had provided weren't evidence of integrity but calculated self-preservation. Helena called within minutes of the news breaking, her voice carrying a satisfaction that suggested this outcome wasn't entirely unexpected. "Well," she said without preamble, "that resolves the press conference problem rather definitively." "Did you know this was coming?" I asked, genuinely curious about how much Helena's network had known about the federal investigation's timeline. "Let's say I had reliable information that Marcus's legal situation was more precarious than he realized," she replied diplomatically. "Sometimes the best strategy is simply to wait for people to destroy themselves." The afternoon that should have been spent defending against Marcus's accusations instead became a celebration of the Metropolitan Development Project's initial funding success. Major investors had committed over $200 million to the first phase, and international development organizations were requesting presentations about replicating our model in other cities. But the personal satisfaction of Marcus's downfall was complicated by an unexpected emotional response. As I watched news coverage of his arrest, seeing him led away in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions about his crimes, I felt not triumph but a profound sadness for the waste of potential his choices represented. "Are you all right?" Helena asked when she found me standing at my office window watching the storm clouds that had been threatening all day finally begin to release their rain. "I'm thinking about paths not taken," I replied honestly. Marcus could have been successful without cutting corners. He had intelligence, charisma, genuine talent, but he chose shortcuts, deception, and ultimately crime. And for what? A few years of luxury that he couldn't even enjoy because he was constantly worried about being caught? Helena nodded thoughtfully. "Some people are so focused on appearing successful that they never develop the skills to actually be successful." Marcus built his career on performance rather than substance, and eventually the performance became impossible to maintain. That evening, I attended a dinner hosted by the International Development Council, where I was being honored for innovation in sustainable urban planning. The event was held at the Plaza Hotel, in the same ballroom where Marcus and I had attended countless charity galas during our marriage. But instead of being his supportive wife, smiling graciously while he networked with potential clients, I was the guest of honor, delivering a keynote address about the future of philanthropic investment. "Miss Rivera," said Dr. James Morrison, the council's president, as he introduced me to the distinguished audience, "represents a new generation of leaders who understand that true success comes from creating value for others, not just extracting value for themselves." The speech I delivered that night focused on the Metropolitan Development Project, but the subtext was about transformation, both personal and societal. I spoke about the importance of building foundations strong enough to weather any storm, about the difference between temporary success and lasting impact, about the courage required to rebuild after devastating setbacks. "The most profound changes often begin in moments of apparent defeat," I said, looking out at an audience that included mayors, development experts, and philanthropists from around the world. "What matters isn't the circumstances that break us down, but the choices we make about who we become in response to those circumstances." The standing ovation that followed felt like more than professional recognition. It felt like acknowledgement of a journey that had taken me from the most humiliating moment of my life to a position of genuine influence and respect. After the dinner, as I was preparing to leave, I received an unexpected call from Detective Michael Torres, the federal agent who had been leading the investigation into Marcus's activities. "Ms. Rivera, I wanted to personally inform you that your name has been completely cleared in our investigation," he said without preamble. "We've found no evidence of your involvement in any of the activities we're prosecuting, and several witnesses have confirmed that you were deliberately excluded from your ex-husband's business operations." The relief I felt was profound, not because I had doubted my innocence, but because federal investigations had a way of destroying reputations even when they resulted in exoneration. Marcus's final attempt to implicate me had failed so completely that law enforcement was taking the unusual step of proactively clearing my name. "There's something else you should know," Detective Torres continued. "We believe your ex-husband was planning to flee the country if his press conference strategy failed. We found evidence of passport applications under false names and offshore accounts prepared to receive transferred funds. His arrest today prevented what could have been a successful escape from justice." This revelation added another layer to Marcus's desperation. He hadn't just been trying to destroy my reputation. He had been preparing to disappear entirely if his extortion attempt failed. The man who had once seemed so sophisticated and strategic had devolved into a common criminal planning to abandon everything rather than face the consequences of his actions. As my driver took me home through the rain-soaked streets of Manhattan, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. Exactly 1 year ago, I had been a financially dependent wife who organized charity events and hosted dinner parties. Tonight I was returning from an international recognition ceremony in my honor, with a 7-figure salary and responsibility for projects that would impact millions of lives. But more than the external transformation, I had discovered capabilities I never knew I possessed. The woman Marcus had dismissed as intellectually limited was now consulting on complex financial structures with some of the most sophisticated investors in the world. The wife he had considered socially inconsequential was being courted by foundations and development organizations across multiple continents. When I arrived at my apartment, a stunning penthouse that commanded views of both Central Park and the Hudson River, I found a bottle of champagne waiting with a note from Helena. To new beginnings and well-deserved endings. Congratulations on becoming exactly who you were always meant to be. I opened the champagne and stepped onto my private terrace, looking out at the city where I had rebuilt my life from nothing. Somewhere in that vast urban landscape, Marcus was sitting in a federal holding cell, facing the complete destruction of everything he had worked to build. But his downfall brought me no joy. Only a deep sense of closure and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served, not through revenge, but through the natural consequences of his choices. The woman he had abandoned on that subway platform was gone forever. Not destroyed, but transformed into someone infinitely more capable and authentic. The rain that had once seemed like a symbol of my humiliation now felt like a cleansing, washing away the last remnants of a life that had been built on someone else's approval. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, new opportunities to create meaningful change in the world. But tonight, I simply stood in the rain and celebrated the completion of the most important transformation of my life, becoming someone who belonged entirely to herself. 2 years after that freezing February night that changed everything, I was standing on the same subway platform where Marcus had abandoned me, but this time I wasn't alone. 50 children from the Metropolitan Development Project's first completed housing complex surrounded me, their excited voices echoing through the station as we prepared to board the train to Central Park for the community celebration. "Miss Rivera, is it true you used to take the subway every day?" asked Maria Santos, an 8-year-old whose family had been among the first to move into our sustainable housing initiative. I smiled, adjusting my coat against the mild autumn chill, so different from that devastating winter night. "I did, Maria. And sometimes the most ordinary places become the most important ones in our lives." The irony of returning to this platform with these children, whose lives had been transformed by the work that grew from my own transformation, wasn't lost on me. The woman who had been discarded here had returned not for revenge or vindication, but to celebrate the creation of something meaningful and lasting. The train arrived precisely on schedule, and as my security detail helped organize the children, I caught my reflection in the train window. The face looking back showed a woman I barely recognized from 2 years ago. Confident, purposeful, carrying herself with the quiet authority that came from genuine accomplishment rather than borrowed status. My phone buzzed with a text from Helena. "Board meeting approved the London expansion. Congratulations, you're now officially overseeing Patterson Foundation operations on 3 continents." The London expansion represented the culmination of everything I had worked toward since my divorce. The Metropolitan Development Project had become a model replicated in 12 cities across North America, and now we were taking the sustainable community concept international. The professional recognition was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from the thousands of families whose lives had been genuinely improved by our work. As the train pulled away from the platform, I thought about the other passengers in my life's journey. Helena had become more than a mentor. She was now a genuine friend and collaborator, someone who had seen my potential when I couldn't see it myself. Sarah had evolved from assistant to deputy director, running day-to-day operations with the efficiency and insight that made her indispensable. Even Derek, my former trainer, had become the fitness director for our community wellness programs. But the most unexpected redemption story belonged to Vivian Chen. After serving 18 months in federal prison for her role in Marcus's schemes, she had been released and was now working as a financial literacy counselor for women transitioning out of domestic abuse situations. She had reached out 6 months ago, not to apologize. We were both beyond that, but to acknowledge that watching my transformation had inspired her own journey toward authenticity. "You showed me that it was possible to start over completely," she had said during our brief coffee meeting. Not just changing circumstances, but changing who you are as a person. I needed to see that it could be done. Marcus himself remained in federal prison, serving a 15-year sentence for financial fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Occasionally, news about his appeals or prison conditions would cross my desk through Helena's information network, but these updates felt like reports about a stranger rather than someone who had once controlled every aspect of my life. The train pulled into Central Park Station, and as we emerged into the golden afternoon sunlight, I was greeted by a scene that would have been unimaginable during my marriage. Hundreds of families from our various housing projects had gathered for the community celebration, along with city officials, international development representatives, and media covering the program's expansion. "Rebecca," called Mayor Williams, approaching with obvious pleasure. "Perfect timing. The documentary crew wants to interview you about the platform restoration project." The platform restoration was my personal contribution to the celebration, a complete renovation of the Central Station subway platform that would serve as a model for accessible public transportation design. The irony of improving the very location where my new life had begun felt like closing a circle that had started with abandonment and ended with contribution. The documentary interview took place on the renovated platform, with the children playing in the new community space we had created above the station. The interviewer, a woman from the BBC who was covering urban renewal innovations worldwide, asked the question I had been anticipating. "Miss Rivera, this platform has obvious personal significance for you. How does it feel to return here under such different circumstances?" I considered the question carefully, looking around at the space that had been transformed from a symbol of abandonment into a celebration of community connection. 2 years ago, I stood on this platform feeling like my life was ending, I said honestly. I had been defined entirely by my relationship to someone else, and when that relationship ended, I thought I had lost everything that mattered. But what I actually lost was everything that was limiting me. The interviewer leaned forward, clearly sensing a deeper story. "What would you say to someone facing a similar moment of apparent defeat? That the person who is destroying your life might actually be giving you the opportunity to discover who you really are?" I replied. "Not everyone who leaves you is doing you a disservice. Sometimes they're inadvertently giving you the greatest gift possible, the chance to find out what you're capable of when you're not trying to be what someone else needs you to be." As the interview concluded and the celebration continued around us, I felt a profound sense of completion. The woman Marcus had discarded had become someone he could never have imagined, not because of spite or revenge, but because of the authentic growth that happened when external validation was stripped away. That evening, as my driver took me home through the city streets where I had rebuilt my life, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought me here. The Metropolitan Development Project now employed over 300 people and had created affordable housing for more than 5,000 families. The Patterson Foundation had become a global leader in sustainable community development under my leadership. Most importantly, I had discovered that my greatest satisfaction came not from professional recognition, but from work that created lasting positive change. My phone rang as we approached my building, a call from Dr. Morrison at the International Development Council with news about the Geneva conference where I would be presenting our community development model to representatives from 40 countries. "Rebecca, the response to your preliminary presentation has been extraordinary," he said excitedly. 3 European governments want to implement pilot programs immediately, and there's discussion about establishing a permanent UN advisory position for sustainable urban development. I accepted the opportunity immediately, understanding that this represented the next phase of my evolution. The woman who had once organized charity luncheons was now being consulted by world governments on policies that would affect millions of people. As I entered my apartment that night, I walked directly to my study where a framed photograph sat on my desk, not a picture from my failed marriage, but an image from the groundbreaking ceremony 2 years ago. In it, I was surrounded by the children who would benefit from our first housing project, all of us holding shovels and laughing as we broke ground on something that would outlast all of us. Beside the photograph lay the fountain pen Helena had given me when I signed my first 7-figure contract, a reminder that the most powerful tool I possessed was my own signature on documents that created rather than destroyed. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped onto my terrace, looking out at the city that had become the canvas for my reinvention. Somewhere in the distance I could see the lights of Central Station, where trains continued to arrive and depart, carrying people toward destinations they might not have imagined when their journeys began. The woman Marcus Rivera had abandoned on that platform in the freezing rain was gone forever, not destroyed but transformed into someone infinitely more authentic and capable. He had intended to end my story on that February night, but instead he had simply given me the opening chapter of a much better book. 2 years later, I was no longer writing that story in reaction to his betrayal. I was writing it in response to my own vision of what was possible when someone finally understood their true worth. And that story, I realized with deep satisfaction, was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.